Hello, hello. Welcome to Tab. This is a solo episode with me, Mana. And I'm excited to do it. I'm excited to be speaking about the search for the real self, the emerging self. That are two titles of James F. Masterson's books. And this episode is inspired by the last interview I did. Maybe you heard it, with the IFS witch, Melissa Gottman. And we slightly touched on this understanding of the self. So sometimes it has a capital S. But there are really many perspectives on this, and I hope you just have your very own. There's no right answers here. Or maybe there are many right answers. So, but there's this idea that there's something that you identify with, or even at times feel imprisoned to be. And then there's who you really are. And often we meet other people's needs at the cost of our own. And either, you can keep doing that, or you can also defend yourself against doing that. But either way, it seems it can bring this hopeless quality to your existence, to my existence. And by the way, that's a little bit of a note here I want to make, that when we get into speaking in terms of client therapist and disorders from, I guess, people who don't have those disorders, I don't know about you, but I'm like relating to all of those sides, really. I truly am. So just keep in mind that I can say you, or me, or we, a therapist, a client, and to me there's not that much of a distance, really. I can relate to all of those anyway. Okay, so this sense of self is obviously a very important phenomena in what we're talking about today. And if that slips away, then it's gonna be really difficult to have a life for yourself. So this episode will tune mostly into my reading of James F. Masterson. And then it is my plan to do a second solo episode from another perspective, and which one is undecided. But this is going to be specifically from his point of view as a therapist. So of course there are different angles to this huge topic of the self. But just to engage in a thematic reflection initially here, I wanted to ask you, what person or creature do you imagine your real self to be? So I will keep talking now, as it's not the kind of exercise where then there's like 10 minutes of quiet. Write down in your journal. No, I'll keep talking, but you can feel into it now, or maybe it will come to you at some other point. I just feel like sharing that my truest self is an old man. Yeah, I know how that may sound. It's not like a dirty old man. It's a wise old man, and it's certainly not one of those very fit old men who looks like they're not old. It's like someone like Michael Mead or Stephen Forrest, if you know those guys. Those are definitely, or Thomas More even. It's absolutely exemplary people for me, role models for sure. So how can that old man be my real self? Well, it's not like you may recognize that in me. I surely haven't embodied him a whole lot in my life as of yet. That's sort of the whole point. Our real being is not necessarily something we have learned to embrace as who we are. At least, let's say us with complex trauma. Then you learn more to identify with what's being projected onto you, since that's more settling than completely not having a self. Then it's more settling to have other people's projections. We need a stable sense of self as a basis for also relating to other people. And then adaptations are inbuilt into our survival, meaning that what we can call the false self or the survival strategies are driven actually by a real need, our real need to survive this. So we can find ourselves searching for the real self in relationships with others, through religion, even the dream of being a talk show host. And I mean, it might help you. Now I'm thinking about this last fantasy of mine. If that was accomplished, that might help establish the real self somewhat. It would give you means to pursue what it is you want, but it might also further us from autonomy and individuality if that sort of dream, if that sort of fantasy about being this big, famous, grand self, if that is really motivated by the adaptive false self. So this is a bit complicated, as you can hear from the very beginning, but so it is with these underlying psychological dilemmas. Just think of the search for acknowledgement, approval. That's something I have in many ways and still do struggle with. It's the Leo signature in you. It's a desire to fulfill your real self, and that's not necessarily anything problematic about it. It's just that when you create something, you kind of have to investigate a little bit. Will I create this knowing that it's unlikely for anyone to see it, to hear it, to witness it? Sort of like I'm doing right now with this podcast. Is it still important in and of itself? I mean, it is tough, because it's nice to have someone approve your creations for sure, but there's something about not letting yourself down. I just have one anecdote that I came to think of from my life. And then, literally the rest of this chapter in the podcast is going to be about James F. Masterson's, my selective reading and understanding of him, at least. So, but just to make it a little bit personal. So some years ago, before COVID, that's kind of we have a whole new timeline, right? So sometime before then, I was in what I like to call an abusive relationship, because I think really it was. It came with this symbiotic bind, obviously, otherwise I would have left it. He was a substitute caretaker. I mean, he was on unemployment benefits at that time, and I didn't have an income, so I felt in a lot of misery. Like, even my caretaker couldn't take care of me. I was pretty low, and I was invited to this party by someone I had interviewed, a very wealthy, prosperous, abundant person. I had interviewed her on Manifestation. So here I was at this very low point in my life, and I get invited to a castle. Basically, it was a castle. And I told myself that authentically, so my real self, authentically, I'm miserable. So that must mean, because I really cared a lot about authenticity also at that time. So I told myself that it must mean I have to show up without makeup, without, I don't remember the clothes, but something very, very simple. I was 100% underdressed, okay? So I decided to do that because very consciously. I could have, put on sort of more of a social mask, but I didn't, because I felt, this is the authentic me. This is my misery. And it didn't feel good to show up like that at all. But I felt it was the only authentic thing to do. And this is the perception, I'll be honest with you, very slowly is changing in me. There's something about, yeah, it's an authentic feeling. Great. Great that you can at least be honest with what's there. But something else is going on too. Because at the party, I didn't enjoy myself. I felt even more rejected and misunderstood as a result. And I did feel the gazes, the looks. I came in low and I went out even lower in my energy. So that's not the real self, actually, that we're talking about today. It was, instead, you can look at it as a strategy of victimhood. But sometimes our intellect, philosophical mind will convince us that this is the concept that's, yeah, this makes sense, so I'm going to do it. But it's actually me diminishing my life, not actively forming my future. It was more of an adaptive strategy from early childhood related to how I could fulfill my mother's or religion's wishes of avoiding separation, of avoiding self-assertion, of avoiding individuation. So showing up like that to that party, I actually behaved helpless and dependent and needy. Also, like, one thing is on the outside, but also on the inside, I felt, these people are so much, there's so much more in life. Can someone please help me? That was my inner attitude. I guess that's equally important to mention. And the funny thing is that I didn't think that, I thought, like I said, I thought I was authentic. But in terms of James Masterson, this denying that the destructiveness of that adaptation, that's a big part of the problem, because this is what I've spoken about before with dissociation. I can do things on this philosophical, higher-minded basis, ignoring how awful it made me feel inside. So my life philosophy, great. I love philosophy, so I'm not trying to put it down, but I'm just saying how it can also trick you, because that told me to show up authentically, right? Whereas my inner feeling was collapsed in helplessness, in a fearful state, that I would even show up and speak openly about. As to, and I'm trying to use James Masterson here, as to coerce the withdrawing mother to return to take care of me. Now, not my mother, but these people that I looked upon as having more privileged, and maybe they did. I think they did, but do see still, because that is, I want to keep also like this awareness of privileges and how society is built on not the most heartful norms, okay? But do see that this is still a strategy to not completely own myself, but to resign due to this inner dilemma. Okay, so that was the story of me and a castle. Next time, I think I should wear some mascara or something. Okay, James Masterson. So I recently heard Larry Singer on Russell Brand podcast or show or whatever it is. And so I'm trying to avoid Wikipedia. I'm not sure if that's what we're supposed to do now. It's just, where can we get information that's not, that's reliable. But anyway, I found in the New York Times, when at the time where James F. Masterson unfortunately died at 84, a full urinary cycle. And I'm just going to read the beginning of that text. Dr. James F. Masterson, an internationally recognized psychiatrist who helped inaugurate a new approach to the study and treatment of personality disorders, including narcissism, died April 12, 2010, that is. He was 84 and lived in New York. His death at the hospital in Greenwich was from complications of pneumonia, his daughter, Nancy Masterson, said. I'm just going to comment This is me knowing very little, but I have 2 very small pieces of something that I'm putting together because it's just a little bit peculiar that James Masterson here, he had a fascination with Thomas Wolfe, who also died of pneumonia. I don't know, maybe just everyone does. So I don't know, but I'm just putting it together that's kind of peculiar because he writes about that. He writes about how Thomas Wolfe dies of that, and then he goes out that way too. And maybe not goes out, maybe is being set free. Okay, a trained psychoanalyst, Dr. Masterson was an authority on narcissistic and borderline personality disorders. He was the founder and director of the Masterson Institute for Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy, established in 1977. I think that's all we need to know for now, because I have a lot to share. So yeah, James F. Masterson, his work is centered around personality disorders of the self. And the purpose, to put it like that, the purpose of a personality disorder, it's a defense. It's a defense to deal with painful affects. So just from, actually this already started, I should have said maybe, but everything that I'm saying is James Masterson, and when it's not, I'm gonna say this is Manna, okay? So I didn't make this up. This is all him. Yeah. So it's a defense to deal with painful affects. And what we're talking about is a developmental arrest. It shows up like self-activation, leads to anxiety and depression, which leads to defense. So this is the triad he's talking about, this disorder of the self triad. And he began, his interest here, it began with a study of the narcissist and the borderline disorders, but he would later go on to open up for this understanding to include all personality disorders. But yeah, in these 2 books, he does call it borderline and narcissistic personality disorder. And I tried to say it a little bit before, but I just want to remind you that this can be related to the inner part of us. So I hope that when you hear it, you don't imagine something really, a person who's like completely perverse and out there. You can surely do that too, but also just that it's related to this inner part that have some of these dynamics there. That's how I use it anyway, and I know that Masterson is saying also don't overlook this, because and that is important as well, don't overlook these symptoms, because it can be overlooked. It can be disguised as in conventional social terms, such as the need for approval that I spoke about. Yeah, that's normal, but in fact it can be the narcissistic need to be perfectly admired and adored, and so we need to just be aware if it's that dynamic. So yeah, keeping both in mind, the extremes and what I speak of, which is more to find it in yourself. And if you think about it astrologically, I'm not going to mention signs because people are going to be very specific about that, but we all have the planets, right? So the borderline, I definitely see that in Jupiter, the dramatic mood swings from states of euphoria to the blackest of depression. And I know there's more to it. I'm just saying a little bit. There's obviously also the impulsive side and so on. And then the narcissism could be our sun, that has this inflated, or can have, if it's not balanced, it has this inflated false sense. So you seem to have everything together, but the inflation is like a balloon, and you need to keep it floating high so you don't feel that insecurity. So these are the 2 sides that he is continually speaking about: the borderline of being preoccupied with fear of abandonment, leading to clinging behavior, and also difficulty with anger and impulses, and denying that the behavior is self-destructive. And then the narcissistic side, that seems to be more immune to life vicissitudes, like being locked in that manic depression. So again, you appear to be the master of your life, and we all have stories about people really making it in the world, maybe being the boss, and then it turns out that the person is quite narcissistic. So yeah, it can be this grandiose master, but then lack relatedness or in pursuit of power more than, actually care about the content. And this is me, Manna, now, because I'm meddling a little bit here, because I do want to say that in Western culture, it is so competitive. So if you're good at winning in a contest because you're motivated by proving your uniqueness and perfection and win the adulation of others, then large parts of our way of working, like the labor market, that's a great match with a narcissistic need to fuel a grandiose conception of self. This is really me, man. I also just projecting things in here, being annoyed that it takes so much to just write an application, and just constantly you have to you have to use your narcissistic side to make it out there. It can seem anyway. Okay, but so Masterson says that when you are a high functioning narcissistic personality, you rarely show up in therapy because you are able to coerce the environment into resonating with your narcissistic needs. So a narcissistic personality will undertake activities that offer narcissistic gratification, such as it could be politics, it could be acting. I'll just add social media to the list. And so he says only when life deals them a severe trauma they consider therapy, because until then they create the illusion of a stable system for maintenance of this self-esteem. Yeah, so it's just a little bit about those two sides. First of all, James Masterson, as he looks, he looks very charismatic. If you've seen him, I've only seen, I don't know if there's several videos of him, but I've only seen one on YouTube, and I thought I can really see his Leo moon, because that's very charismatic. He also has an Aries sun, so two fire signs. It's very perfect that he's known for work around asserting and activating the real self, right? It's so on point. So I hope you see the astrology right there. Even though I know when I say things like this, there's so much more to a birth chart, and I feel like sharing more, but sometimes I feel if I share too many details, the point just kind of goes away. So let's just keep it at that for now. So he has said about himself that he's been hovering or circling around the emotional problems of the self for over 30 years. Working through and trying, and so he said that in 93, right? So we have to add some years to that number. I just thought of it. Okay, but so it's for many years. He's been working through and trying to master the outer layers of the problem in order to find the core, a concept of the real self and its disorders. So in this first book I'll speak about, it's called The Search for the Real Self, and it's from 1988. And then I'll shift to the book where I just had I just lent something from that. It's from 1993. It's called The Emerging Self, and he wrote many books. But a center theory to his work, he's taking that from the psychoanalytic tradition, as I understand it, is that of object relations, which is the interactions of the self and internal and external objects. So it's a theory that say that self and object representations do not exist independently, but in relationship, called object relations unit. So an object is someone or something. amazed by how many things it can be. It can be a person, it can be a country, it can be an animal, it can be a poem, it can be a mountain, anything really that is loved or hated, something invested with emotion. And the first object of our love is in general the mother. So now there are also internal objects that is a mental representation like memory, ideas. So how we feel about ourselves and others really depends on our inner relationships, our internal images, because they are the ones that powerfully influence this, how we see everything. So in the beginning of our lives, we can't separate from our environment that we depend on for existence. This is where the baby and the parent or caretaker relationship is everything. It's pre-verbal, it's undifferentiated symbiotic self-object with no clear distinction between self and object. So that's how it starts. It's the basis of stable sense of self, is this internalization. And then you can later distinguish yourself from the caretaker and anything else. So we need both halves, so to speak. If we were totally separate from it, then we can lose ourselves. And so we take in aspects of our relationships and make these a part of ourselves. So in object relations theory, we look at internal and external relationships, the interpersonal and the intra-psychic functioning. I hope you heard that. So inter and intra. It's a huge area, and I definitely feel drawn to it also more philosophically, which is my tendency, because then we can reflect about what is the nature of reality. What is the nature of reality if my reality is bound to what I have internalized inside of myself? And this is sort of the landscape that Masterson adds to. And for anyone who's really fluent in object relations theory, I'm sorry for this explanation. It's just based on some notes, and I know it may not be totally coherent, but I hope that it clears up as we go, because it is a concept that's very fundamental for his work. Yeah, I guess I said mostly about object as it actually. We also, of course, have to talk about the self. So there's the object and then there's the self. The self is understood to be what is closest to you, a representation of your own person. But it's also difficult to define what that self is in object relations theory, and I think Masterson is trying to do that because, for example, he replaces the word individuate with self-activate, and then placing more emphasis on the concept of self. I don't know about you, but I'm having I love this word, self-activate. Just pondering the word has actually opened up some doors for me and inside myself at least. So in Masterson's terminology, what is the real self? Well, the real self emerges in early intrapsychic development and grows through your upbringing, and then in adulthood, the self must be articulated in reality. Unarticulated aspects of the real self can lie dormant for many years, though, only to surface in surprising ways later. I find that reassuring. But in this search for the real self book, he outlines the healthy real self, and you can sum it up, but he actually has 10 criteria that I'm gonna go through. I think it is important, the one about that you can manage crisis that is upsetting to your own normal pattern of life without being paralyzed or totally defeated. I think but they're all really good. So let's go through the 10 criteria of what it looks like when you have a healthy, real self. Number 1, the capacity to experience a wide range of feelings deeply with liveliness, joy, vigor, excitement, and spontaneity. So not blocking these feelings, okay? Second, the capacity to expect appropriate entitlements, meaning if you had early experiences of mastery coupled with parental acknowledgement and support, then the healthy real self built up a sense of entitlement to appropriate experiences of mastery and pleasure, as well as the environmental input necessary to achieve these objectives, meaning you expect that you can master your life, right? Number 3, the capacity for self-activation and assertion, meaning you identify your unique individual wishes, dreams, goals, and you're able to be assertive in expressing them in an autonomous way. Number 4, the acknowledgement of self-esteem, which allows you to acknowledge you have effectively coped with a problem, a little bit like what I said before. Number 5, the ability to soothe painful feelings, so that when things go wrong, the real self devises means to minimize and soothe painful feelings. 6, the ability to make commitments. Despite obstacles and setbacks, you don't abandon your goals and decisions. 7th, creativity. For example, finding new ways to cope with loss, and also the ability to diffuse the negative memories and feelings that we associate with certain activities or situations, so we can freely engage in them from an emotionally neutral or positive stance. 8, intimacy. The capacity to express the real self fully and honestly in a close relationship with another person with minimal anxiety about abandonment or engulfment. 9th, the ability to be alone, which enables you to manage yourself on your own, also through periods where there's no special person in your life, and the ability to organize your life around worthwhile pursuits, some of which can require that you leave your family or friends to achieve a goal. So to not be dependent on others to activate your real self is what he's saying. Number 10, the continuity of self, the capacity to recognize that you have a core that persists through time and space, a core that remains the same even as you grow and develop. Yeah, doesn't that sound lovely? We all could use that. Okay, so let's look into the narcissistic personality. In the narcissistic personality, there's not a real emotional relationship with a therapist, but there's this defensive facade underneath which lies an extreme vulnerability. And it looks like either idealization of the therapist or no involvement at all in the therapy. And the therapist needs to interpret that it is narcissistic disappointment with the therapist's failure to mirror the client perfectly, because that exploration will lead to the source. The client's need for perfect idealizing or mirroring as a defense against his depression and impaired self. And I hope that you hang in there if you are not sure what I'm talking about, because it's gonna make sense a little later. But just to start somewhere, a therapeutic method, a way to heal this is to follow that thread of the depression with this narcissistic personality, because the emotional detachment is what he calls the false self, and that is the one that is inflated. So following the thread of depression will then give way to a real emotional involvement And it's possible to create a therapeutic alliance in that way. So Therapeutic Alliance, James Masterson defines as an explicitly conscious understanding that the patient and therapist are working together to help the client achieve mature insights into the nature of his problems and the means to alleviate them. So the borderline personality. What can happen here is that the therapist comes to the center of this personality's preoccupation, to the center of their psyche. They can't get the therapist out of their mind. So both for the narcissistic personality and the borderline personality, there's an impaired self, but they have a different form. So with the borderline personality, you have limited capacity to tolerate anxiety and frustration and certain reality limitations, such as to distinguish between fantasy and reality or between past and present. And the problem for a borderline personality arises from a conflict between the developmental arrest of the ego and from defenses constructed against a depression. So again, I'll come back to this term. But now in therapy, the borderline personality projects onto the therapist's feelings towards parental figures from the past without any awareness of their true origins and without any perception of the independent existence of the therapist in reality. So how can you tell if you're projecting and, by the term of Freud, repeating what is forgotten in behavior? Well, James Masterson poses that question in the second book, and I don't feel he's really answering. In a way, he says, if there's an answer, this is, I think, my reading of the answer is that in a way, the client can't know when he's acting out in transference. So, because it's like an old football game, it's just on replay. So in trauma therapy, in general, as you know, we work in the present time, because what will happen here is that the client's replay of earlier scenarios, that's happening without him remembering their links to the past. So James Masterson calls it infantile feelings. It's the past dragged into the present, projected onto the therapist. And now the method therapeutically for the borderline is to bring clients' attention empathetically but firmly to the denied, maladaptive, self-destructive aspects of his defenses. That's the terminology of Masterson is calling it defenses. Yeah. So now let's look at the abandonment depression, or fear of abandonment. He says that it's a mark of maturity that you can get through periods of depression either on your own or with the help of someone, but the experience of abandonment depression is far more serious and devastating than the forms of depression that come and go in the course of our daily lives. In the throes of abandonment depression, a person will feel that part of his very self is lost or cut off from the supplies necessary to sustain life, and this is a place where thoughts of suicide are not uncommon. When one is brought low enough repeatedly, it becomes increasingly harder to imagine oneself happy again, able to push through life with the strength and confidence with which the reasonable, healthy go about their daily living. In therapy, it shows up in clients who share that they feel cornered by duties and activities, that these activities do not trigger enthusiasm or interest. There's a numbness that's pervasive, and it's like it's unending. So the roots of their depression with those descriptions push farther into the past than what seems to be just apparent about what's going on in their life in the present. So abandonment depression, it's really about separation. experience. It's the fact that a child's self-image emerges from this symbiotic image of the mother, and the effort to separate and individuate from the mother is therefore a two-track process that involves the separation from the internalized mother image and the parallel evolution of the capacities of the self. The capacities of the self is strengthened by the child's self-assertive exploration. Now, what if the mother could not provide the specific form of nurturance that allows this unique individuated quality of the child's real self to emerge? You know how a child needs a supportive environment that is physically stimulating, yet safe, socially challenging, yet manageable for the current state of development, that is. Also intellectually exciting, yet emotionally secure, right? So if the caretaker does not respond adequately because she herself is psychologically disturbed, or she herself suffered from an impaired self, when the child's self emerges, then her unavailability produces the climate in which the child's real self will not be able to emerge. So maybe the mother felt abandonment. Maybe she felt threatened by the child's emerging individuality. So she used the child as an object to defend against her own feelings of depression over separation. Consequently, the mother was unable to respond to the child's unfolding individuality, and the child in turn learned to disregard and fear parts of his potential self that he realized threatened the mother. So to continue to have approval from the mother, the child would suppress feelings, wishes, and activities. For the child to thwart his desire to individuate due to the unavailability of the mother is surely destructive to the growth of a child. This is what we talk about also in attachment theory, right? This is me, Manna, just reflecting that. And James Masterson is also talking about John Bowlby's studies and how he's also using that as a fundamental study to his theories. So from that, just classically, the child will either cling or distance himself emotionally, clinging because the child's psyche became fixed in this development, or distancing if the mother's clinging becomes too intensely clinging. Okay, so now abandonment depression. I'm still trying to get to the core of what abandonment depression is. He actually calls it an umbrella term beneath which 6 horsemen, and I hope you can hear I'm smiling just because I appreciate the way that he explains this. Okay, abandonment depression is an umbrella term beneath which the 6 horsemen of the psychic apocalypse ride: depression, panic, rage, guilt, helplessness, and emptiness. Now, these 6 horsemen create pain and terror, and no wonder that many people prefer the unholy allegiance with a strong, false defender that can ward off the psychic havoc these horsemen strew in their path. The intensity and immediacy of these 6 feelings can become unbearable in people with a severely impaired sense of self, Masterson says. And to the rescue, the false self comes, but the payment for the so-called feeling safe by the false self is the failure of the real self to develop autonomy. So what is this false self? The nature of the false self is to save us, to save us from knowing the truth about our real selves, from penetrating the deeper causes of our unhappiness, from seeing ourselves as we really are, vulnerable, afraid, terrified, unable to let our real selves emerge. Nonetheless, when the defenses are down and the real self is thrown into situations calling for strong self-assertion, situations that trigger the repressed memories of earlier separation anxieties and feelings of abandonment by the mother, the serious nature of the depression is glimpsed and felt. So the false self is not really able to protect us after all. Now, in the case of borderline, nothing is black and white here. You have this split perception of reality, and the pathological false self is ultimately good for the person with a split reality, because it has been his usual method tested over many years to avoid depression, meaning a method of not feeling bad. It's not actually good. The false self is not actually good, but in the sense of being unaware of the damage being done to this person. Yeah, because he denies that the self-destructive behavior and denies his distorted view of reality. So it's just to say that it serves something. Now, in treating this personality or sub-personality of borderline, Masterson shares that they are extremely sensitive to the unconscious rewarding and withdrawing responses of others. And for a therapist, it means that you have to remain in control over your responses, because this type of client will test the therapist to see if he is really competent and trustworthy. The turning point is signaled by one of two developments. Either clients recognize their false self and give it a nickname, or depression occupies the center of the therapeutic stage. And by working through depression, like we said earlier, then that's where the real self can start to really flower. So at this crucial juncture, when the abandonment depression has been attenuated and the difficulties with the real self-activation emerge, clients often explore new interests and activities. And what must be understood here is that it's a new development due to earlier developmental arrest, because a part of a person's personality was left in the closet. Okay, and by the support of the therapist, the client can overcome the difficulties and slowly learn to identify his real individuated wishes and articulate them in daily life. He learns the mastery and coping skills and builds self-esteem. So it's not that the therapist is cheerleading all of this. Yeah, you can do it. The therapist cannot direct, force, seduce, intimidate the real self into activation. This is something he really emphasizes, that we cannot do this for the clients. Therapists can only respond to the client's initiative. And in the course of therapy, the client will vacillate between enthusiasm for new interests and the fear that comes from attempts to activate the real self. In other words, this is to be expected. And Masterson has something he calls communicative matching. I don't think I'll go too much into that, but I will quote him from page 150 and 151, because this really touches me. Healthy adolescents embark upon the task of these years with a fairly well-consolidated autonomous self, with access to the capacities and functions needed. Despite the enormity of the struggle and the number of social and psychological tasks confronting them, healthy adolescents can emerge from the teenage years with a minimum of scars and symptoms, prepared for the further development in young adulthood. Adolescents with a deflated false self, however, enter their teenage years with enormous handicaps. They cannot rely upon an autonomous self and its capacities because the self has been arrested in the earlier stages of development, and they are fully defended against abandonment depression, which their impaired real selves are unable to face. Okay, I'm skipping a bit because he has 4 groups of teenagers that he goes through, and I will just select the group that I was really blown away by reading about. There's a 3rd group of teenagers who give up the struggle of resolving the abandonment depression altogether by throwing in with an authority figure who will relieve them of the task of taking responsibility for themselves and who provides them with an alternative authority and system of beliefs and values to guide their lives. Blinded by the exuberance of their new lifestyle, their initial impression is that they have found themselves or arrived, but the relief they experience is merely a stopgap which impedes the development of their real selves. This type of teenager makes up a significant proportion of those who join religious communities such as Jesus Freaks and Hare Krishna, who join cults and communes based on one anti-establishment theme or another. It's not America's social values they reject as much as the need to establish and take responsibility for themselves. Oh man, I was just, he's talking about Jesus Freaks. That was one of my primary teenage identifications. Anyway, how are you doing out there? Hopefully the whole concept of the false versus the real self starts to make some sense as it's put into some contexts. Now, a really important chapter, I think, is chapter 11, which is titled The Therapist as a Guardian of the Real Self, because Masterson describes how in the beginning of the therapy, clients with inflated or deflated self, narcissistic or borderline, express their wish for the therapist to take over and reinforce their false defensive selves and thereby enable them to feel better. And they only become aware of the profound harm this response would do to their welfare only much later in treatment. His point is that the therapeutic relationship is not social but professional, and that the therapist's challenge is to serve as a guardian of the emerging real self by maintaining also an emotionally neutral stance. And this stance safeguards the patient and the therapy from the tidal wave of the patient's false self's projections and creates the conditions for the emergence of the real self. So we will be returning to this neutral stance, just saying it is so that the therapist can provide a neutral reality framework against which the client can identify, contrast, compare, and work through her transference projections. So, and we're gonna return to that big time. When we're able to see each other as we are, both good and bad at the same time, that's the whole point, then there is that capacity for whole object relations, rather than a transference where the therapist serves as a target upon whom infantile conflicts and affects are projected. So now, why do borderline clients come to therapy? It's not strictly accurate to say that they come to get better, Masterson says. 95% of their motives is to be taken care of by the therapist. Although they do not articulate this in these terms, to get better involves getting depressed. to get better involves getting depressed, according to this philosophy of the abandonment depression. And most borderline clients don't want to get depressed. Their hidden agenda is to get the therapist to resonate with their needs, to be rewarded and supported, and to serve as a new caretaker for them, so that they will feel better and get the emotional supplies they wish they had gotten earlier in life. But if the client succeeds and the therapist resonates with this rewarding pattern, he will give up his role as the guardian of the real self. That's why it's so important with the guardian concept. The client will behave regressively and treatment will no longer be effective. Another hidden agenda could be to lure the therapist into resonating with the negative image they have of their parents. Because if the therapist then will become the withdrawing rather than rewarding parent, clients can discharge onto the therapists all the angry tension that they could not discharge as children. Either way, the client seemingly cannot lose here, because therapy is this fantasy of all the supplies they wanted as children, and they still need those supplies. Or they get the opportunity to relieve the anger over not getting them. Now, the narcissist's motive is not to get better either, but to be admired and adored by the therapist. Failing that, the narcissistic personality will use the therapist as a target for his rage and disappointment over not receiving the admiration he expects. So the reason for this is that they are rooted in defensive selves and poorly developed egos, bound by their projections. And the therapist's neutrality and objectivity function for the client as a life preserver that rescues him from his projections and safeguards his individuality. Okay, this is really important stuff. So important that I just had to take a break. So if I sound differently now, it's because I'm back. New and refreshed. I haven't taken a hot chocolate break. And this is not like a commercial or anything. I know that it could sound like it. But it's a really good thing when you've stopped eating sugar after an addiction with sugar, to have different sweet things that you can go to. And one of them is, for me, is hot chocolate, because you can do that without, you can use honey instead of sugar. And it's not even, there's no problems with it. Something wonderful with no problems in it. It would make for a good commercial, actually. Anyway, let's get back to the really important stuff here. And that is to have that objectivity as a therapist. And in order to have that, so because that's the safeguarding of the individuality is really to screen our own emotions. Screen our own emotions. So emotions that spring from the therapist's own personal past and have little to do with the treatment of the patient. We also monitor the client, what the client can handle emotionally, and limit interventions accordingly. I just have this quote from page 194. The therapist must be a real person, not in the sense of sharing his personal life with he says patient, I say client, okay? Sympathizing with his real life defeats, congratulating him on his triumphs, and playing the part of an auxiliary ego in his confrontations. Throughout, the therapist must insist that the patient will survive emotionally only by learning how to cope and adapt. This does not mean that the therapist personally cares about the patient in the way that many borderline patients wish for and insist on. If therapists were to become personally involved with each patient, they would probably flee their professional calling due to emotional exhaustion. And later he says that if there are loopholes in this neutral frame, then it gives the client an edge in luring the therapist either into playing the rewarding parental figure or into playing the disapproving figure, which becomes the target for the client's rage. So this is the point, not to be a caretaker, but a guardian of the real self. And he continues to say that many therapists also have deflated false selves. I love this. Since therapists too emerge from the same background of family conflict as their client often. In fact, certain characteristics of this work, this therapeutic work, attracts people with personality disorders. A therapist with a deflated self can use the neutrality. A therapist with a deflated self, when that is the case, you can use this neutrality and this professional relationship with the client as a fantasy substitute for the genuine intimacy avoided in real life. Are you thinking about someone? Have you met this character? A therapist with an inflated false self can enjoy being the center of the patient, the client's lives, and this role feeds the sense of grandiosity. Okay, so you see how well you will perform as a therapist professionally. That depends on to what extent you have become aware of your own problems of self-activation and self-emergence, and to what extent you have repaired them. This neutrality is important on both sides. It means resisting either borderline or narcissistic attempts to manipulate parameters of therapy for their own end, so that instead you take responsibility for what he calls the abandonment depression. I think it's close to what we could call primary emotion, and work through it. Now, his last chapter is on creativity. In this book, by the way, there's one more book for today. This last chapter in this book, and it's on creativity. It's so the Leo moon. I love it. He says that creativity is the birthright of the real self. I'm sorry, but can you hear the astrology? Okay. The creativity is the birthright of the real self. The ability to invent old patterns in relationships, to rearrange old patterns in a new way. And here, and in an earlier chapter, he really shows me that he would have loved, maybe not, this is a little bit cruel maybe when you've died and you can't defend yourself, but I think he would kind of have loved, I hope he would have loved astrology, because he emphasizes this point a few times, that you are a product of nature and nurture, of genetic inheritance and developmental encouragement, so not everyone has the same capacity for expressing creativity. I'm gonna stop referring to astrology here, but it's just, I feel it's very much the same concept that we are, astrology is just proving how different what different capabilities we come in with. And also now to James Masterson's point here, this is really true as well as in astrology. It's reflected in the astrology. It's actually not reflected in the astrology, because what I'm about to say is what you do with it. And often, most times we can't see that in the chart. I mean, we can see tendencies. That's why I say most times. But what we do with it, that's kind of another level than what we are actually born with. So he makes this point throughout the book about being willing to forego creative endeavors, about making peace with living below their full potential. For example, experiencing the inability to get down to doing the work, or following through on it, as a defense against the anxiety and depression, which creative expression can cause. Now, through art and creations, the real self that wasn't able to emerge as a child can be expressed. I want to read something from page 209. The fully developed self always has access to its creativity, but artistic creativity does not guarantee a fully developed real self. Many artists with severe disorders of the self are fortunate to have the talent that produces the urge to draw upon their creativity, thereby finding and establishing a segment of their real self that allows them to adapt to life more successfully than they probably would have without that talent. In effect, they ameliorate the depression and strengthen the real self, even though it remains impaired, through creative expression, which unlocks other impaired capacities such as self-esteem and self-activation. Although these links are fragile, they can rescue the artist from the typical tragedies that result from a personality disorder. Creativity thus becomes the primary path in the artist's quest for the real self. There are a host of writers, painters, artists, sculptors, and actors whose lives would ably demonstrate this. I have chosen Sartre, Edvard Munch, Thomas Wolfe, because they are well-known representatives of three different artistic media, and each used his medium to defend against the abandonment depression and express the real self. They are respectively the philosopher, painter, and novelist of the abandonment depression. Because they express the same theme, and because that theme resonates with nearly everyone who encounters their works, their artistic achievements assume a universal quality, as it is true of all great artists who deal with themes of developmental conflict, such as coming of age, loss of innocence, with which we can all identify. Yeah, okay, so we're actually gonna move to the next book now. Let's move into 1993, The Emerging Self. In the preface to this, he says that his perspective since the book we just looked at, and actually also since another book in this sort of series from 1981. So there are three of his bibliography that is about disorders of the self. So since those, he has grown and changed and shifted, which is kind of annoying for someone who just spent months disciplining herself of actually reading these books. But the great thing is about reading that no author really get to take it back, because I've already read it, right? I've already read it. And also let's bear in mind what happened astrologically in 1985. It was a very different time because Pluto just entered into Scorpio. And it was personally for James Masterson, his second Saturn return also in Scorpio. So what does that mean in 93? That Pluto is now on James Masterson's Saturn, transforming psychological alignment, transforming what he found to be credible psychologically. So you can play around with the astrological meaning of it. Also in 93, Saturn is now squaring his Saturn in Aquarius, meaning that the search is now differently looked at from a higher vantage point of Aquarius. So his intention for the Emerging Self book is to present for therapists a developmental self and objects relations approach to psychotherapy of the Closet Narcissistic Disorder. Okay, so now we have an additional word here, closet. Closet. Okay. He describes how therapists can confuse a borderline person with a closet narcissistic disorder because with narcissists you expect, apart from other symptoms such as, we've talked about that, I think, lack of empathy and interpersonal exploitation of others, cool indifference, and a fantasy of unlimited success, you also expect exhibitionism in the sense of requiring attention and admiration, like the sun, making yourself in the center of it all. But that's not the case with the sun in the closet, right? If you're a closet narcissist, you can really mimic the borderline and, like a chameleon, take on the colors of other disorders. So the closet narcissist projects the ideal onto others as a way of regulating his own sense of grandiosity. So to use the term from before, if you have a closet narcissistic disorder, then you have a deflated false self, just as the borderline. And so the idealizing transference acting out of the false self is confused with the clinging defense of the borderline. Now let's tune into what narcissism is, because he says there is healthy narcissism. That is the real self. So the healthy narcissism is when you have a sense of self and that feels adequate and competent, and your feelings are mostly derived from reality with some input from fantasy. So that's appropriate. And then the narcissism that we're talking about is different, and it is due to a developmental arrest that happened before the age of 2. I think that's really important to remember, that it happened at such an early vulnerable point. And what happened? I mean, he says that the reason is complex and poorly understood. And it could be that the mother was herself a narcissist or emotionally detached, or that she ignored the child's emotional needs. But anyway, the child's real self has suffered, and the child is going to resonate with the mother's idealizing projections. Now I want to read something for you that I think you're going to like. I liked it. Okay, so it's on page 13. To illustrate, if you're reading this book to glean information that will make you a better therapist and enable you to help your patients more, and you acknowledge me as the source of this information, then that is healthy narcissism. On the other hand, if you're reading the book in order to gain some knowledge that will make you feel unique and special, and you cannot acknowledge my contribution as the source of the feeling, then that is narcissism of the exhibitionistic disorder. Finally, if you're reading this book because you have idealized me and are basking in the glow of that idealization as you read, that is the narcissism of the closet narcissistic disorder. On the other hand, to turn this around, if I wrote this book in order to teach what I have learned so that it can be used by others, and I acknowledge the importance of students to the process, that is healthy narcissism. If I wrote the book in order to exhibit my special, unique, grandiose self for perfect mirroring and to not acknowledge the students, that is exhibitionistic narcissism. Finally, if I view the audience as idealized and the source of my self-esteem, and wrote the book to gain admiration and thereby reinforce my grandiosity, then that is closet narcissism. It's also important to keep in mind that a patient can have narcissistic traits without necessarily having a narcissistic disorder. In other words, the patient may have an excessive interest in appearance, power, money, beauty, or the like that is an isolated narcissistic trait that does not result in the creation of the intrapsychic, fused, omnipotent object, grandiose self-representation of the narcissistic disorder of the self. Yes, that is so good to remember, that we can have traits of this, and I think that most do. Okay, let's move on to how to work with it. He has a concept called narcissistic vulnerability, and the mirroring interpretations of it is what therapeutically then can lead to affects and memory, and then you can work through the abandonment depression. So mirroring interpretations is such like saying, it appears that the focus on the self was so painful that you had to avoid self-activation as well as relationships with people to protect it. And in other practical terms, he says that it's the drive of continuity that make the therapy work. So for me, this is me, Manna Midling, I offer either once a week or every 2 weeks therapy, and more. I don't like if there's longer in between. I don't feel confident it's going to work that much if there's longer than 2 weeks in between. But also, and this is still me, Manna, just commenting on the material here, because I'm also a big proponent of self-therapy, just in conjunction to facilitated therapy. So what you can do continuously is to reflect upon what your unique talents, wishes, and needs are of your real self. And then look to what aspects of the external environment fit those needs. So to create a positive feedback between the real self and the reality of the environment. This is what James Masterson suggests is the answer to finding meaning in life. It's the Leo moon again. I mean, this is really great, and I think it's also great to do on your own, to consider that your unique talent, wishes, and needs of your real self. I would have to talk to my inner old wise man, who he has to be wise and look old. And then look to what aspects of the external environment would fit what you found there. What is it you would want? How does it fit the reality of what I'm in? Okay, back to therapy. So in therapy, the client is invited to self-activate. And that evokes painful affects, plus the defenses against those affects. This is a core concept of the way that I work as a therapist, and it's no secret that the reason why I'm reading certain authors is because my own therapeutic stand is like based on their work. So this is such an interesting concept. This understanding that what we do is to track the sequence of self-activation, painful feeling, and then a strategy to move away from it. And you can call it defenses like he does, or strategies. It has many forms, like attacking voices, internal attacking voices, denial, intellectualization, idealization, avoidance, isolation, and detachment are some of what he mentions. So that's all taking you away from the real self. And in sessions, the manifest of the real self capacities, that's listed on page 79. So let's go through those. It's on that chapter called Tracking the Emerging Real Self in Psychotherapy. The capacities of the real self are as follows. 1. Self-image of being adequate, competent, based on reality, with some input from fantasy. Intrapsychic representation as whole, both good and bad at the same time. 2. Self-assertion, to identify and activate individual thoughts and feelings. A. Access to and expression of creativity. B. Support self when under attack. C. Act in a spontaneous, self-supportive, adaptive, realistic manner regarding 1. Taking physical care of self-diet, work, exercise, schedule, appearance. 2. Expressing self through work, recreation, relationships. 3. Soothing self when in conflict. 4. Autonomous functioning of sense of self. 5. Identifying and expressing one's unique creative ideas and urges. 6. Seeing objects as they are in reality, both good and bad at the same time. 7. Being able to acknowledge one's own self-activation and to set self-limits. 8. Maintaining self-esteem by coping with and mastering reality. 9. Having the capacity for continuity, commitment, and intimacy, a capacity to feel and express empathy with the object. And he says that this shift from defense to self-activation occurs slowly and in small steps, and it takes time to integrate and consolidate. So it's not like one day it's just gonna show up with all of this on this list in the client. It takes time, and then it gets to be consolidated in behavior. Okay, so how to get there? That's what we're talking about now. How to work with disorders of the self. Well, Masterson says that this therapeutic stance, I told you we would get back to it, of being neutral, responsive, and interested in helping the client with the problem is so important. And now the client will be devoted to avoid self-activation. And as the therapist, you are actually devoted to self-activation, knowing the price that the client will pay for not going there. So to me, this is me meddling. To me, that's not exactly completely neutral. And I've had discussion with different therapists about this, because I don't know. I think it depends on really how you define neutral. But in the context of Masterson, it makes sense, I think. He really clears it up for me, because he says that the therapist must not be personally involved. I know this is a repetition. It's from his second book. There are some repetitions. Must not be personally involved with the client, and must maintain this neutral position without resonating either with the client's wish to be admired or feeling attacked. And the reason why this is important is that when the client is in transferring, acting out, it's to defend against feeling and memory. So the client externalizes on the therapist problems from the past without realizing it. And that's why neutrality is a protection against such projections and one's own countertransference. So in this book, he goes more into countertransference, and he defines countertransference as those emotions in the therapist that derive from his own unresolved earlier relationships with his parents that are projected onto the client. But countertransference is also used more broadly as all emotions in the therapist that interfere with the ability to provide a therapeutically neutral frame. The neutrality is a life preserver that sustains the integrity of the treatment under pressure that comes from both sides, the client's transference, acting out projections, and the therapist's counter-transference. Now, for a closet narcissist, and this is really an emphasis he has in this book, the closet narcissist, the therapist is actually the problem, because at the beginning of treatment, he will relate to the therapist on the basis of his projections. And if the therapist resonates with, let's say, the idealizing projection, then the treatment loses momentum. And why are we as therapists vulnerable to countertransference? Because many therapists has a rescue fantasy. Are you with me? Right? To the degree that the therapist's own self-development was deprived in childhood, they project this self-representation on their clients. And then they do for their clients what they always wanted to have been done for themselves. Especially if you as a therapist didn't have healthy parents, but had severely difficulty with developing a sense of self, then you can end up treating yourself and not the client. So it's very important. And reading about countertransference kind of out of context of therapy it wasn't out of context of therapy, but I wasn't enrolled in any education at the time. That's really what drew me into this work. That maybe sounds weird, but it really resonated, and I could do a whole chapter on how I came into this, I think, quite sacred work another time. So there's also something called projective identification, which Masterson defines as the client projecting upon the therapist, usually negative affects associated with either the self or the object representation, and then behaving in such a manner as to coerce the therapist into actually accepting and feeling this projection. It's subtle, indirect. It can be through facial expression or more overt behavior. The reason why the client, who is a closet narcissist, has this thing going on, is that he himself was the receiver of projective identifications. The parent projected onto the child some unwanted negative aspects of the parent's sense of self. The client was required to behave in a helpless and hopeless fashion without any self-activation, and in fact he would be attacked if he did self-activate. And this dynamic results in an intra-psychic structure of an underlying harsh, attacking, aggressive unit, a self-representation of being bad, inadequate, hopeless, and helpless. This is then defended against by a grandiose self-object representation of an idealized object that provided support and admiration for compliance in giving up the self. Yeah. So the lesson, one of them for the child here, is to deal with painful affects by projecting it onto others and coerce others into containing and processing it. So this just is not just happening in therapy, but in any relationship. It could be in any relationship. If you have this issue, if you have this narcissistic closet narcissistic disorder. But the client can, let's say it's in therapy, where the client projects an attacking object representation on the therapist, and then experiences the helpless, hopeless, inadequate sense of self, and feel that the therapist dislikes him and is devaluing him. It could also be reversed, that the client projects being inadequate onto the therapist and devalues the therapist, which would be a defend by turning passive responses into active responses and identifying with being the aggressor. Now, as a therapist, it's important not to react to the projections, but to reflect and interpret. The therapist can then stay aware of the projection and make it available as something to work through, like naming what's in the room. So it enters the boundaries of reality. How? What do you mean? Okay, let me give you an example from page 223, and you may clap if you recognize it. Okay. A therapist reported seeing a client who had been in a local prestigious training group, but had to drop out of the group and out of treatment. Unable to face her feelings of humiliation and embarrassment at the implied inadequacy in herself, the patient started treatment with a new therapist whose ability she questioned. Did the therapist, the client asked, have the ability to help her, the client? The therapist identified with this projection, becoming very anxious as to whether in fact she did have the capacity to treat this person. In this way, she identified with the client's feelings of inadequacy, humiliation, and embarrassment, rather than reflecting the question back and interpreting it to the client as follows. Perhaps you were so concerned about my capacity because it was so painful to face up to those feelings of humiliation and embarrassment you had, and your way of soothing them was to place them in me. Yeah, so you want to identify, and this is both due to the client's real self and your real self, and have as much focus on the client as on this counter-transference, because that is the obstacle to the therapeutic process, James Masterson says. Now, the key to identifying the projective identification is found in the details of the therapist's own feelings about the client, because for the client it will be unconscious that she projects her impaired self on the therapist and coerces him to identify with the projection, and by devaluing him. Now, this can hit the center of target of the therapist's own feelings of inadequacy, and that can then lead to the therapist caretaking the client. So it's important to identify this intra-psychic source so the therapist better can control it and make more appropriate mirroring interpretation, which will make the client take back the projection and begin to reflect on his or her impaired self. This is specifically to a closet narcissist, because the closet narcissist is used to giving up herself and to idealize the other person, let's say, because it could be either idealized or being aggressive. And in that process, she loses her own sense of self, who she is and where she wants to go. So I hope that you can see the relevance here when we're talking about the real self. It's so coming into like the depth of therapy here, and from the specific perspective of James Masterson. But I think it's so relevant because we can lose ourselves in interactions, and it's kind of just amplified in the therapeutic setting. If I, as a therapist, for example, relate to being the caretaking object, meaning I'm only on solid ground if the client, for example, doesn't feel that I'm criticizing her, then you start to take over the process, and you reassure and you soothe the client, and you create this fusion, really just trying to make us feel better here. Your client, but also yourself. And this is paralysis. It's paralyzing to the capacity for the therapist's real self to act in a more free, self-activated, spontaneous manner. And it stops. It puts an ultimate stopper for the contained affect. So being aware of your own feelings as a therapist and remembering this role of helping the client track what he's doing, track the adaptation that comes up. That is so. And when you have a disorder of the self, it's painful to focus and explore yourself. You have to remember that just from the minute maybe the client sits there, comes in and sits there, they can feel attacked and criticized. So it's really a way of soothing that pain, of focusing on yourself and exploring yourself. A way of soothing that is to put it on the other person. So what to do instead is that we, as clients or as people, right, what we do instead is to recapture the central affects or primary emotions of the authentic impaired self. And it's going to feel sad and it's tough to go there, but it opens up windows of hope and foreshadows the progress to come. Okay, so are you asleep? If you are, it's well deserved. let's catch up another time, right? I could come with many comments, but probably no one is going to be awake by now. And also, I was planning on doing a second one on the real self. So let's just say our goodbyes. Keep examining yourself. Have fun with it, and you're welcome to keep coming back to this podcast, which I hope can be a place to call whole.